Alright boys, you already know what time it is. Honkai Star Rail just had a new animated short drop, and this one's dedicated to Firefly. So we're gonna see how this goes. I'm just gonna watch it, and then afterward we're gonna start analyzing some art stuff, see what we can pick apart, maybe we can notice some mistakes. If not, hey, that's cool too. If you're new here, like the video if you enjoy it, and dislike it if you don't, whatever the case may be. Comment down below what your thoughts are, and you know what maybe you learned new from this video, and also subscribe, because I'm gonna be making a lot more videos like this, and also a lot more videos just based on stream content and stuff like that once I actually get situated, which hopefully would be within the next like 4 weeks. So we'll see. Anyway, let's just get into it. I'm gonna try to watch silently, but I might like.
Firefly requesting reinforcements. The swarm requesting reinforcements to Rift Valley. Forward! Requesting reinforcements. I repeat, requesting reinforcements. On your feet. The target straight ahead. Keep pushing forward.
Affirmative.
Whoever's still alive, cover me. I'm going for the swarm mother. Copy. Take it. What's this? Activate it when you see the signal.
Now commencing scorched earth operations for Her Majesty!
Her Majesty!
Okay. Okay.
Am I dead? Who died? Born to fight. Such is the honor of Glamoth's cavalry. For Her Majesty. Why do we die? Why do we live.
For Glamoth! For the Empress!
But Glamoth no longer exists. I dreamed of a scorched earth. A new shoot sprouted from the earth. It bloomed in the morning sun and whispered to me. Like fireflies to a flame.
Life begets death.
Fireflies dancing among the stars.
Okay. Huh. Well, initially I thought maybe I would have a tough time watching that silently, but I actually managed to do it. At least for the most part. I mean, I still, had a little... Had a few things to say throughout it, but I definitely bit my tongue a lot trying to, not interrupt it. Anyway, now we're going to start analyzing some things. And already I did actually notice a few things that I see are a little bit of a struggle, and I think it comes down to what the studio had to work with. But... excuse me, sorry. Let's just get into it. So I'm going to turn this down by a lot, just so that it's not, like, giving anyone a headache. But here we go, the opening shot. This is what I consider to be the opening shot because the first one isn't really, I don't really consider that to be opening shot. But I guess we'll just talk about it a little bit. They did a really good job with her eyes. So this is all 2D drawn, I can tell, but the way that they lit her eyes, it's just very extravagant. I like the way that they did it. That's pretty much my only comment on this. It's nicely done, and it's mostly on 2s, I would say. That looks like it's animated on 2s. Yeah. Probably animated on the 2s. Anyway, we have this scene right here, which actually I'm quite a big fan of. And what's cool about it is they're using the 2D parallax effect, which is actually something that's like, has been used in animation ever since the beginning of it, pretty much. Because the way that they used to do animation was that they would take let's do this. All right, I actually have some sheets right here done for my comic storyboarding. I'm gonna try not to like show any. It doesn't really matter, but let's just say you have 3 layers, right? 3 layers: your midground, your foreground, and your background. So they would take the midground, leave it centered, but then they would take the background and sort of pan that to the side and then have the foreground pan to this side, so it gives the illusion that the camera is rotating around the midground subject, which is just really cool. It's one of the age-old animation techniques. It looks good pretty much in every case that it's used. And also it looks like some of this might actually be 3D planes, but I can't quite tell. Because it is actually rotating. So they might have actually like placed these 2D paintings of the environment into a 3D software like Blender or something, just to scoot it around and have it actually rotate in space as well. But yeah, pretty cool. There's a lot of depth to this shot for sure. Now here is where like there's so much VFX in this, and I can like this is why I think it comes down to what the studio had to work with whenever I'm gonna get to the problems that I saw during this animation. But like just look around. There's so much happening. Constant VFX happening, constant explosions, a lot of visuals that need to be clean in order to be believable. They need to be stylized. So all of their efforts went into the VFX for this, and that's why a lot of the character action isn't actually like too overbearing in terms of like the workload on the animators. You can actually see that there's a scene where they use slideshows to depict the different Fireflies like breaking through into battle and things like that. I'll show them in a second, but things like that, and then also using a slideshow or sort of like I guess, yeah, a slideshow, like a crossfade explosion of the planet that they were on at the end. But yeah, if you look at these VFX, like, they are pristine, top-notch, and they are very well composited. Like, usually you draw this stuff in 2D, you don't do any of the glowing effects and all that stuff. You save that for the video editors. They will handle all of that to make sure that the color correction and compositing is all together and done right. Then there's actually a particle simulator happening. So in editing softwares, there's usually some form of a particle simulator, and it basically can take any image and turn it into a set of particles that just randomly generates, right? And you can change its trajectory, you can change its speed, you can change the rotation of it in 3D space. Usually applications will have that. So right here, when you see the bugs like whizzing by and stuff, that's all particle simulation that's made to look like, you know, a bunch of bugs, but really it's just little PNGs, and it's all being just randomly generated into more and more and more of them in a certain trajectory at a certain angle. You get the point. Now here, the suit itself is obviously 3D, but it is composited in a way that makes it feel more 2D. You have the cell shading that's really selling it very well. Like this just, if I could see visible line work here, I would assume that this is 2D. But I can't see visible line work here. It's all 3D stuff. But like, if you ever looked at the old Gundam anime, they had these huge mech suits that they would animate by hand, and you could even see in like the Genga or like the work in progress stuff from the studios. It was like, this stuff was all hand animated, and it was animated so gorgeously. But I think now with mech stuff, most studios tend to lean towards 3D and CG, just because it's a lot more convenient. Instead of having to remember where all of these little pieces and trinkets and gadgets go, you just have this 3D model that does it for you, basically. So they did get a lot of time to focus on the VFX stuff here. And again, whoever the VFX directors were on this, I would assume there were at least 2 or 3. There could be less, I don't know, but usually for an animation of this length, it is a pretty long one. It goes all the way, yeah, it goes all the way to the end of the video. Unlike the Honkai Impact 3rd ones, where it would be like 3 minutes of animation and then 3 minutes of credits, or like 6 minutes of animation and then 2 minutes of credits, whatever the case may be. This is like, it just goes completely throughout the video and there's no credits at the end, which I honestly kind of miss seeing the credits, because that gives more, you know, it gives more, in my opinion, more respect to the animators who worked on it. But that's just me. Anyway. So generally, a lot of this is really being propelled forward by the video editing and the fact that there are 2D VFX presets that are drawn by, you know, VFX artists during the production of this animation in order to make it all, you know, happen together. But it is very, like, it's really being brought together by that. I think the video editing and the VFX work is really carrying this forward. The 3D animation is very simple, believe it or not. It's not something that's like it. Okay, I say it's simple, but it does take a level of mastery of the craft in order to actually animate these things in a simplistic enough way that still feels believable, it still moves right, still has the impact that they're looking for. So I'm not saying that the 3D animators are bad. I'm just saying that it's something that's simple, and it's like, it's very much, it's intentional. It's an intentional piece of the puzzle for all of the 2D stuff to really carry the visual stylization of this. because for the most part, if you were to just take that 3D model and just place it in a gray empty space, there isn't really too much definition there. But because of compositing, because of lighting and color correction, all that stuff, it's really being brought together. More VFX stuff. Now here is something that I love seeing little things like this. And in animation, it's like, I've pointed at things out like this before as well, but like when particles just kind of appear out of nowhere, in order for the impact to feel, in order for there to be more impact, that's basically what it is. So when the other Firefly's arm just like swoops by, breaks all of these insects into pieces, and you can see their matter just sort of dispersing into the air. One frame it's not there, the next frame it is. And their use of impact frames on this is essentially just taking one frame and bumping up the brightness a little bit. Sometimes impact frames don't have to be insane, especially when you want there to be some sort of build-up. Usually the climax of that build-up is what you want to use impact frames on, whereas like the lead-up is something that you kind of reserve it. Because you don't want people to watch this just getting flashed the entire time, right? So just having that little bit of a, you know what I mean? It's like lighting a little lighter in front of someone's face, just like, you see that? Yeah. Before you drop the big explosion, right? And again, constantly, throughout all of these scenes, leading up to the big explosion, there's just nothing but particles happening in the background. A bunch of particles. Even the floating debris back there, those are 2D like PNGs of like 4 or 5 different asteroids or like pieces of rubble or insects, whatever the case may be. And it's just one PNG, and it'll either float around or it'll have particle generation that allows it to sort of like disperse and randomize. Now here, this is actually a interesting little industry tactic that's usually employed in specific lighting situations, because sometimes you just can't get away with it, and you'll have to try something else. But in this case, because the lighting is so dark and they want you to focus on the distance with that big nuclear explosion, there is the ability to tone down the foreground and have it cost less, basically. So either they painted this by hand in 2D, or they just took a little 2D plane, like a rectangle, placed it at the bottom, and then had like waves and noise distortion there, along with some speed lines going over it, which just gives it the feeling of a moving chunk of land, when really it's just a little thing that's wobbling like this. In like, I don't know, moving on twos or something, and it's just wobbling back and forth, wiggling around like a little worm, basically, visually. And then you have things like little chunks of rubble and things like that just sort of popping up and like scooting from the center of the frame all the way out to the outside, and you can just repeat that. You can copy paste it and just scoot it along the timeline so that it's just one goes, one goes, one goes, one goes, one goes, one goes, and it just keeps going until it makes the illusion of running over the ground with a bunch of rubble in the way. And also, you'll notice that all these Fireflies are they are running with pretty much the same animation preset. But it works because they're randomizing it using 2D VFX over the top. And this is the scene where we can actually dive into that a little bit. So what I mean by the 3D animation is genuinely being carried by the 2D. You can really see it here. The 2D is doing everything here. Every single thing. Like the 3D animations, they did one preset, and then they just copy pasted it across like a little plane and basically just had them run in place on screen. That's the 3D version of it. But in 2D and in video editing, you have this painted texture of the ground from the side, and it's sort of whizzing by constantly, just a massive parallax of the ground. And then you have all these VFX swooshing by. You have like the big planet in the background, the smoke, the mist, everything is just like, it's piecing it all together. Also, my neighbor is singing. Just ignore it. But like genuinely, the impact of this, every single footstep of this particular Firefly that's closest to us, we feel the impact of that footstep because the camera is shaking every single time their foot hits the ground. We have also the camera is shaking every time they punch one of those incoming, are those insects? Or are those just, I don't know. Looks like it's some sort of blast actually coming toward them and they're breaking it out of the sky. Which is interesting, I like it. But yeah, compositing is really carrying this quite a lot. Oh yeah, and here's another little thing. Only 2 of the Fireflies are actually doing like a lot of the action, where the rest of them are just kind of running. They don't really have to do anything else because we already have 2, basically in animation, when you have 2 characters that you really want to focus on, any number of characters that you really want to focus on in one shot, that's heavy action, high octane, or even not in heavy action. Sometimes it could just be a dialogue scene, but they always talk about having fighting action points, and basically what that is, it's not actually about fighting or action. Well, it's about action, but definitely not about fighting all the time. So if I'm talking and then I'm also moving my head around and then my hand is also doing this, now you have these fighting actions, right? So you have things that the human eye is going to fight to look at. So if a character is animated to move a certain way and then lift their hand up while they're talking and try to demonstrate, like point somewhere, you want the flow of the animation to sort of lead it there. So that's why, for instance, Disney animations, you would have a character lean forward and then extend their hand and, you know, go for a handshake or point somewhere. It's like the motion of their body has to lead into the next point of action. So that's part of motion composition, and this is why, in a lot of cases, it's shown in multiple different ways. You can have different characters doing different things, but usually another character will leave the focus for the other character to become the main focal point. So here, you see it happening where the one closest to us is fighting first, and then he slides out of slides out of frame, and then we have the next one. So it's all just like, this is general animation stuff that's done in the industry. There's different terms used for it in every studio as well. People will often be like, and that term isn't a real industry term. It's different for every single studio, I promise you. No one has this like preset thing where they're just like going to the books and being like, oh, this is what this is called. I mean, they can do that, but a lot of people just make names up as they go. Especially because they have these very specific situations that they're trying to call for, so they have to give it a certain name for their studio and for that project itself. But also, here's the thing that I was talking about before, where they have a bunch of slideshows that sort of demonstrate what the characters are doing. And you can tell that like these are either 3D renders that are then converted into 2D images, or they just painted it in 2D. I think it was probably 3D converted to 2D just because that's more convenient, and I can even see some of the smudging and stuff done from like computer. It's basically like AI that would sort of like take a 3D PNG, like just take a PNG of like a 3D model and then toss it into a program like Photoshop or Clip Studio Paint and then switch it to an artist filter or like a painterly filter of some sort. You'll likely get some sort of like paint smudging effect, and then they'll likely just paint over it again with a little bit of lighting and composition in order to bring in like the fact that there's a big explosion above their head and things like that. And then on top of that, they would export those things into different layers, different individual files as well, so the character would be separate from the rest of the image where you would see the explosion. You want it to blend together, so you're obviously going to paint the character with the idea that the explosion is there in mind, but generally these are all exported as separate PNGs so that you can move them around in the editing software and make it, you know, flow nicely. So that's how you get the characters moving separately from the explosion. The explosion is separate from all the debris, and even the debris is separate from each other. There's different layers of it, so and you get things like this. And I really like their use of 2D assets here, because these smoke and mist effects are mostly just 2D painted in a digital software, but this it gives so much depth to the scene, the way that they did it, the curves and everything, the way that it brings the eyes up on a curve, sort of like if you look at the golden ratio composition, it's kind of like that. It's very much like a big swirl that just goes up into the Firefly's arm, which is really cool. And yeah, just slideshow after slideshow, in order to sort of break apart the monotony of having to animate all of that and keep all those particles going. For those close-up scenes, sometimes, you know, slideshows can also be used for impact as well, to sort of show like this is all flashing by the character's eye, right? So it's not always to save budget, but it does save budget as well. It just does. Things like this also help to save budget. So instead of having the character fly around and create all these explosions when the camera's like zooming around to follow them, you can just pan out, have everything set up to basically indicate you just saw the character and now you see all these explosions going off and you know how fast that character was going. So the human mind can just put 2 and 2 together and be like, oh, the character's making those explosions. Pretty plain and simple. This right here, I think, is a product of what they had to work with, because the actual imposing doom is something that is not very clearly seen. You can't actually identify what the fuck it is. So I think with the 2D art team, they probably had a sort of reduced time frame to really work with in order to bring this into frame and try to make it believable. But also they're trying to make this thing feel like a nightmare, right? Like all this lighting that you have is like a bunch of gray and red and black. It's all just like a bunch of darkness. It feels like a nightmarish land that you wouldn't want to go to. And so in order to sell that tone, that's also part of that, just keeping everything sort of darkened out to where you can't quite make out all the details. Everything's much scarier, much more imposing when you can't, like when it's unknowable. So yeah, also again, we have particle simulation happening around the big broodmother. I don't know, but particle simulation. And here's the thing, like right here, all they really have to do in order to get this effect of the wings flapping is very cleverly done, because they never actually they never actually come into focus. Like these insects never actually come into focus, and it's a good thing. They break focus, like if you look closely, everything in the background gets blurred out for like a split second. But the reason why these insects never actually come into focus is because they get to save a lot of art budget on having to do any details on them. So they just basically do these like little shaped figures and worry about the rest of it, like the glow and the shimmer of the wings. All that is done in video editing. Literally all they have to do for things like that is like apply a little wobble effect and take something like with a radial blur. Radial blur means that it's circular, so they would take a radial blur and just blur it so you'd have a hand like this, but it would look like it's being phased out, like up and down, and it sort of like curves with that phasing. So you get all of that, and then you have like a little wobble effect, and then you just add like a shimmer with another layer that maybe adds a glow onto it, or you just have an add layer on top of it and it just swings by with a mask over it. You never really know, but that's sort of how it can work. Just from my knowledge of video editing, I used to do it for, oh my god, I think it was like 7 years or something. I did video editing largely for esports stuff with like League of Legends and all that. Some pro teams as well, but like it was, in some cases, there were just things that you had to compensate for whenever you're using a 3D camera in a game like League of Legends, where there is there's camera culling. And basically what that does is if the game's little in-game camera system phases through an object, it's just gonna cut it out. So you kind of have to compensate by painting new textures in and layering them over the footage that you have. That's basically it. And again, like all of this is just particle simulation. So Now here, we actually have 2D effects sort of billowing over this massive cliff face. I think the cliff face really only exists in order to break apart the composition and sort of establish the size of this mother versus the fireflies down below. I do think that it would serve better to lower that a little bit, just so that we can see more of the actual enemy, but that's just in my opinion. This right here, a bunch of still images basically, with just a lot of particles. Now this is really well done. This right here, I think this is actually one of the most attentive shots done in the entire animation. Because not only do you have so much depth with the particles that are being brought in, you can also see they're kind of clipping through the character's body a little bit, but they're really making that a lot less identifiable by bringing things closer into the foreground, by also having the character sort of, you know, get dragged around by the impact of all these things. But this is what I really like, is as the armor is breaking off of her, you actually get to see it happen in real time. You know, there's nothing that's like cutting away from it. It is literally just like each piece is falling off. The hair is entirely 2D while the body is 3D. And I don't know, I love the way that they did that. Okay, so there isn't too much to talk about with the previous shots, but this one is something that I think is it goes unnoticed a lot in animation, how simple it is to just take a running animation and make it feel much faster than it actually is. Because the way that humans run is just this, right? And you have like the legs like tapping against the ground like that. It doesn't matter how fast you're going. Usually your legs aren't going to move too much faster. You're just covering more ground, usually, especially with a suit that makes you faster. So in this case, it's like you can take a simple animation of just running and as long as the ground is moving really fast and there's the impact that's felt with every single step, you actually, it's so believable. It's so incredibly believable. But like genuinely, you can see like the background is moving on ones, but the character is moving on twos, and you can see how slow the legs are moving comparatively to the speed that they're going. Also, this is one of those shots where I think they actually did 3D after setting up the 2D, because there's just so much going on here. It's hard for a 3D artist or a 3D animator to actually get their hands on like what this scene would look like if it wasn't storyboarded out, if it wasn't already sort of planned out with the effects happening, or at least examples of the effects happening. Sometimes it could just be like a little green circle that shows explosion here, explosion here, explosion here, have the character dodge it. And that's basically what they would import into Blender so that they're working with that and they can actually time it properly, to where you get something like this. There's 2D effects happening and the character is reacting to it. Really beautifully done shot as well. And again, there's also the use of parallax effects over the background. Like this background actually isn't moving very fast. Or I should say mid-ground, because the background is the big, like, broodmother. But yeah, the land here isn't actually moving very fast. Some of this is probably actually done in 3D, honestly, but it could also just be 2D effects that like has a fisheye lens over it, and then they're just they're just panning it across like this, and it sort of curves up naturally due to that lens effect. Now, what's really cool about this is that the actual, like, the use of blur actually changes. So it goes from a Gaussian blur of the background, where you can't really see much. You see how everything is, like, faded out and kind of fuzzy? That's a Gaussian blur. And then as the impact happens where they land into that spike, you'll notice the blur has actually changed. And now it's more of a lens blur, which is like, it basically takes lights and turns them into, was it hexagons or pentagons? I don't know. But yeah, it's like, usually this is a type of blur that's used for scenes of beauty or sometimes in scenes of grief, to sort of elevate the feeling, the emotions there. But in this case, I think it's sort of trying to emulate our Firefly's like perspective of this happening, where she like sees her teammate impaled and she's like, you know, a little bit teary-eyed, a little bit worried about it, you know, that sort of thing. But very nicely done. The use of the flash in the background also is not accidental. It's entirely intentional to sort of sell the impact of what's happening, right? These are essentially impact frames for this character throwing their mask away. Goodness gracious. Alright, so here is another example of why I think that the studio didn't have a whole lot of time to work with 2D art. Usually those sort of outsource VFX stuff, they usually don't have VFX artists on hand at the studio. Sometimes they do, but usually they just bring people in temporarily to get the VFX done and, you know, figure out, especially with lead VFX artists, they usually don't have those full time at a studio because that can be very costly. So they'll usually just have them come in for the project and then they'll go do something else after. But here, when you see the big creature burning up in the background, there's no detail to it. It's completely blurred out, and it doesn't have to be, but it is, and that's something that I think is, it can be an artistic decision, but in this case I think it's genuinely something that they're probably trying to withhold details from the viewer in order to save time efficiency. So they were probably put under a little bit of pressure to actually get this out, and I genuinely wonder if some of the animators are a little bit like bummed out about what they didn't get to do here. Because I know from my experience in working in animation or working with animators, it's like everybody wants to make something that is amazing, that's game-changing, that's like just absolutely gorgeous, but sometimes you can't with the constraints that you have or the time limit that you have, so you kind of just have to cut corners and make do. Here, I really like the post-processing. I mean, if you were to take a look at this when it's just a raw drawing, it would all just be flat colors with no lighting. There's no cell shading or anything happening. Or at least, you know, not to any particularly notable degree, but color correction and grading and all of that stuff, compositing, it really helps to sell the shot and the feel of it as well. This sort of desaturated desolation, that sort of feel. And even at the bottom of the screen, there's like a slight gradient of gray that's sort of placed down there. And we get to see this open shot with all of the fireflies that died. Some of them are male, some of them are female. Also with the smoke effects here, they are likely just 2D effects, like 2D drawings that are just a PNG, and then they slide up horizontally. And that's basically it. Either that or they're particle simulations, but usually it's just hand-drawn. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. They also made pretty good use of, you know, trying to censor body parts because they're all naked. They're trying to censor body parts by basically just burying them under the rubble or putting them behind some of the dead carcasses of the insects that were flying around and things like that. Just making good use of like their inset pieces to actually hide, you know, genitalia and things like that. Another thing that's also being done to, I think it's being done to sell the scene a little bit more, but also it can be used to kind of save a bit of time. These characters are animated mostly on 2s, I would say. So I don't think it's much of a budget saving thing to have them animated in a dark background like this, but you do get away with having a lot less detail and not having to draw all the body parts, you know what I mean? Like, these are two characters that aren't concealed by the ground around them or by any carcasses. They are just standing out in an open field. So they're using mist, they're using dark lighting, like both the characters are just completely darkened out with silhouette. You do get to see some details, like Firefly's hair, for instance, but the rest of her body is just a little blob. It's not really like, there's no details to it. You can see the shape of her body, but in terms of what's like there, you don't really see any lines that sort of demonstrate curve or anything like that. Even like the side of her breast, usually there will be a line there to indicate where the breast even starts, but there's nothing there. And honestly, that could be due to censorship things on the corporate level, because I think some animators would probably just draw that line anyway because it's just one line. But it could be a corporate censoring thing for the sake of the animation and not having it age restricted, you know? Also, they are using chromatic aberration in their blur technique in this scene, which just makes everything feel more high-tech, more digital, you know, all that stuff. It's like a slight tonal thing that's usually used for anything that has to do with mech in animation. Just a little detail I forgot to point out earlier. You can even see it on her hair here. Like if you look toward the edge of it, you see blue there, right? But then like toward the edges of it, you see like little hues of green and yellow. Again, I love the way that they do her eyes as well. It's the most saturated thing in the frame. Everything else is sort of grayed out or like not very saturated, but her eyes, her irises are like very specifically quite well colored, and they just, I don't know, they look great. That's a still frame. That's also a still frame. That's a still frame. This is a still frame. But they're using sound design to make it feel more impactful, right? Now this right here is actually a pretty hard shot to animate. A character looking up from this angle is quite difficult, and I can see a few things that might be a little bit off, like for instance the how skinny her arms are from this angle, unless it's just intentional. I don't know. Usually with anime, skinny girls are like the thing. Skinny girls with somehow big breasts. But from this angle, I would actually expect to see more of her breast from over the top. That's just like, logically, you would at least see a little bit of a bump over here under her hair, but they probably have to hide that for the sake of, you know, not getting age restricted in any way, or being flagged for nudity. partial nudity. But like, if you look at this shot, I mean, just look at how it looks. I think it works really well here, but as the camera sort of pans out, there is a lens distortion effect that sort of shrinks everything down. It goes from like this longer plane of like, you know, her looking up, and then it sort of like shrinks down in foreshortening. So she begins to look a lot more like a little midget, especially with the other character over there that's kneeling down. So that's a problem that I see. I also think that her shadow isn't entirely in line with where it was meant to be. I think it should have been dragged out just a little bit more, in perspective-wise. But yeah, she's just not matching the scale of that other character. She should be standing taller because the other character is kneeling down. That's what we saw in the previous shot, which was right here, right? Like, we can see the difference in their height here. But yeah. But yeah, sorry, I had to knock my door. Anyway, yeah, this just doesn't quite like sell her height compared to the other character. Also, a bit of the dialogue does struggle here because it doesn't quite feel, it has a continuity issue, and I think it's because of translation. But just having like, why do we live? Why do we die? And of course, like, she does have a flashback to where they say for Glamoth, right? But it's like, it doesn't quite feel like that's answering her question. So her following that up by saying, but, as the start of her sentence is just like, it doesn't feel impactful. It's a little bit more confusing than it is impactful, I would say. Now this shot is something that I think is very, very, very well done. Now here's the thing. Usually with these sorts of scenes where you have plant life growing in like almost like a time lapse, it is drawn completely separately from everything else. And it's drawn, instead of it being in this 16:9 resolution scale, it's usually done in like almost like a mobile 9:16. So it's, instead of like this, it's rotated like that, and that's how they would draw it in the actual art software. And the reason for that is because they want to make sure that the plant itself, or the object that's growing or morphing, has continuity no matter where it is on screen. So you animate it on this vertical resolution in order to be rid of any sort of like, oh, if you need to go back and scoot it around, you don't have to redraw anything. Plus, you can have it anywhere in frame and it will always make sense because that's the way that it's drawn. So things like this are sort of drawn on like some sort of horizontal plane like this. You just draw it on there and you go frame by frame. I think this is animated on ones. Yeah, this is animated on ones, which is very, I mean, this is hard to do. And they likely had a completely different artist come in to do this specific shot. Not even kidding. That artist did not handle drawing her, most likely, at all, but they probably handled that plant. And that was basically their job for the day. These take a very long time to do, especially as pristine as it is, with all the details. You can even see some bits of like bark that are drawn on with like little line details. There's so much going into this. Like, that is beautiful. That is absolutely gorgeous. Now here, watch the debris. Like, you see how oh my god, that is beautiful. That is, wow. Wow. Yeah, that is absolutely astonishing VFX work. I mean, my God. Wow. That's insane. But yeah, like the debris, it just kind of like spawns in from underneath all of that. And then it sort of fans out. You can see like there's so many layers working together. Usually these layers don't look good on their own, and this is something that like a lot of young VFX artists will like. They'll get into VFX art and then they'll be like, oh, why doesn't my VFX look as good as the professional? Is because there's layers upon layers and layers and layers and layers that are working together to make it all come together. Like things like these little green streaks that are like almost like a Super Saiyan power-up flame, right? It's like sort of like jittering around, and they have this like nasty-looking blur on them. That's stuff that you don't even notice when you're watching it. It sells the speed at which they're going, but like you don't go frame by frame on this. But like a lot of people when they're just getting into animation, and especially trying to handle VFX, because they want to draw these cool fight scenes or whatever the case may be, they might notice, oh, their effects don't look as good or as clean as because they're not using lines of action to demonstrate where their effects are going to be going. They're not paying attention to the fact that there's like several layers that work together as well. But yeah, this is really well done. These are also just random pieces of rubble that they just painted in, and they just added like a little zoom blur basically that all converges down to one point, and it just blurs everything out in that sort of radius. And then the takeoff. Now here, there's a very distinct level of where the 3D is versus where the 2D is, because now we're in bright lighting and you can really see where the 3D is struggling. You can even see like some of the textures on the suit's neck is like being stretched out and sort of distorted. But again, you only see that for like one frame, and all the 2D stuff, it's very hard to mask into this scene because they didn't really composite the 3D too much here. I honestly, I think that they should have. I think they should have brought it to more of orange and sort of darkened up the suit just a little bit where the light wasn't hitting, just to avoid all this being visible, because you can really see where it's struggling. You can see all the low poly details, the line work sort of glitching out. Or sorry, not glitching out, culling out. It's like a bunch of things like that that are just like escaping into the frame that didn't even need to be there, honestly, in my opinion. And you can see like really right here is where you can see how the 2D VFX are struggling to blend in with the 3D. It's very apparent where the 3D is versus where the 2D is. But it's something that they can get away with for the most part. I mean, even like the little blasters on the body, like you can tell that's not part of the 3D model at all. And then we go into this right here where like the background is moving, but it doesn't feel like it's moving, if that makes sense. Like it's all just kind of scooting to the side, and then you have the character just placed there in the center of the screen. It's like this screen is just perfectly tracking them, which makes it feel unnatural and kind of uncanny. Now this beautiful VFX work again, I have no complaints about this. This is amazing. This right here is just a slideshow. And it really didn't need to be. I think if they had a massive explosion that was beautiful with a bunch of VFX and stuff, it would have sold the impact a lot more, I think. But it's not something that they were able to do, I think. I think they probably had a lot of constraints going on with when this animation needed to be released, and when, you know, based from like when they started working on it to when it needed to be released, they probably just did not have enough time in their full disclosure. So they did what they could. And yeah, I think they did good. This right here, PNGs. I love the way they animated Kafka here as well. Very nicely done. Those are all of my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been a 54-minute video analyzing 6 minutes of animation, as we always do. But yeah, thank you for clicking. Thank you for watching. I will make another video like this sometime soon. stay tuned for that. Have a good time zone wherever you may be. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.